This week, with Election Day just a little more than 2 weeks away, we welcome the two candidates seeking to represent the 45th District of the New York State Senate, Dan Stec and Jean Lapper, for a face-to-face, hour-long debate. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Vote 2022 election special. I'm Tom Helling. Tonight, we're hosting a debate among the two candidates running for the 45th Senate District seat here in the North Country, a Senate district that is now the largest in all of New York State. The newly drawn 45th has grown even more in size, extending well into St. Lawrence County, including the villages of Messina, Canton, and Potsdam. And we are pleased to welcome the two candidates, Democrat Jean Lapper from Queensbury and the incumbent Republican Dan Stec from Queensbury. The questions tonight for the candidates will come from our colleagues in public radio. Cara Chapman is the Champlain Valley reporter for North Country Public Radio, and Pat Bradley is the North Country Bureau Chief for WAMC, Northeast Public Radio. We welcome you both. Random draws have determined the order of opening and closing statements. The candidates will have 60 seconds, 1 minute to respond to questions, 30 seconds for rebuttals. We begin with opening statements, which will be 90 seconds from the candidates, and Jean Lapper will be our first candidate with opening statements. Jean, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom, Cara, Pat, and for Mountain Lake PBS and the League of Women Voters for hosting the debate today, as well as to my opponent for participating. I appreciate the opportunity to introduce myself and to discuss my campaign. I'm Jean Lapper. I'm a longtime resident of Queensbury, where I've raised my two daughters, and I'm happily married to Pete, who many have met on the campaign trail. I'm a CPA. I own a small business and accounting practice in Glens Falls, where I primarily work with small businesses and their owners. I'm running for Senate to protect access to reproductive health care, to protect our economy, and to grow the North Country economy, and to protect our environment. Make no mistake about it, choice and reproductive health care is on the ballot this year, and we need to act now. We need to protect our precious environment, and for that reason I'm supporting the Environmental Bond Act, which will provide critical funding for clean air, clean water, and to modernize our infrastructure. It will, while providing good paying jobs to make families, sustainable families for the North Country. And we need to make sure that we get our fair share.
Ms. Lapper, thank you very much. Mr. Stec, a minute 30.
All right, thank you. I'd also like to thank PBS Mountain Lakes for hosting this, and my opponent as well for joining this process. I think it's important for voters to hear directly from candidates. I'll just start by reintroducing myself. My name is Dan Stec. I was born and raised here in the district, born in Glens Falls, grew up in Queensbury. My dad's a retired forest ranger. My mom's a retired school secretary at the high school. Graduated from Queensbury, went to Clarkson University, graduated with a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering. I'm proud to point that out because with the redistricting, now Potsdam is located in the Senate District. It'll be a nice opportunity for me and an honor to represent my alma mater. While I was at Clarkson, the Navy recruited me for their nuclear power program. I was a Navy officer for 8 years. I served in the Persian Gulf during Desert Storm. And while I was in the Navy, I earned my MBA. I got out of the Navy and got involved in public service. There are 84 towns in the district and 2 cities, so familiarity and comfort with local government and those issues is extremely important. I was town councilman for 4 years. I was a town supervisor for 9 years. I was the chairman of the Warren County Board for a couple of years during that time. I served in the Assembly for 8 years, and now I'm finishing my first term in the Senate. As far as direction, we'll hear more on the subjects later, but I think it's also to point out that a wide variety of support has been sent my way from people that follow Albany closely and knows what it takes to be effective. I'm proud to have the endorsement of the Business Council, the NFIB, the Teachers Union, NYS, Public Employees Federation, IBEW 2032 out of Messina, Plumbers Local 773, 4 or 5 different statewide police organizations, as well as a member of the Farm Bureau's Circle of Friends, and I have an NRA rating of A+, and I'm the endorsed NRA candidate. So a wide variety of support, and I'm pleased to have it. Thank you for having us again.
Mr. Stec, thank you. Candidates, thank you for the opening statements. It's now time for our first round of questions, and we will begin with Cara Chapman with the first question, and it will be going to Ms. Lapper.
Thank you both for being here. Starting on the topic of abortion. Earlier this year, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. In New York State, the right to an abortion was already codified. So in preparation for a potential influx of people seeking abortion care here, Governor Kathy Hochul committed $35 million to expanding capacity and upping security at abortion providers. A different bill, proposed but not passed in the state legislature, would make the fund permanent, and it would allow the money going to providers to be used to cover abortion procedures and related expenses for out-of-staters. A recent Siena College poll found that more than 2/3 of New Yorkers believe abortion should be always or mostly legal. Should taxpayer dollars be used to pay for abortion services for people from other states?
Thank you, Cara. I am fully in support of access to reproductive health care for women. I personally had an experience with miscarriage at 16 weeks where I needed the care that I needed at Glens Falls Hospital, and as a result, I'm here today. I lived through it, and I have a 23-year-old that I was able to have after that event. I think that women need to be able to have access to health care, and it's unconscionable that we are saying that it's going to be decided state by state. In New York, we need to be a leader where we protect women and where we provide access, and that providers need to be protected so that we have skilled access or skilled care in our state. If we limit the providers and we create criminal charges and repercussions to our providers, the women of the state won't be able to get the care that they need, and the women out of the state won't be able to get the care that they need. And we need to protect the women.
Ms. Lapper, thank you. Mr. Stec, 1 minute.
Cara, the last part of your question is you wanted to know if taxpayer funds should be used for out-of-state abortion seekers?
Yes.
Okay. My position on abortion is very clear. I'm right to life with exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother. The most recent changes in New York state law expanded the availability of late-term abortions, which most New Yorkers and Americans are opposed to. It also decriminalized all abortions, meaning that a woman that was 7 or 8 months pregnant and had a wanted pregnancy, if she was assaulted, pushed down a flight of stairs, punched, and we've had incidents like that happen in the Glens Falls area not too long ago, formally that person could be charged with the homicide of that unborn child. Now under the new state law, that is no longer an offense that they could be charged with, only the charge of assault against a woman. So those are the two reasons why I mostly objected to what we did. As far as making taxpayers fund abortion for out-of-state people, I'm opposed to that, and again, I believe most of my constituents are as well.
So I just want to reiterate that I fully support access to reproductive health care. This is a medical decision, and that I believe that women are able to make the decision that they're able to with the care and the guidance of their provider, as well as the spiritual guidance that they need. This is not an abstract idea or abstract issue for me. This is something that I've lived through, and it's essential that we protect women's health and that we protect women's right to privacy and that they're able to make their own decisions.
Ms. Lapper, thank you. Cara has a follow-up question now. We'll go to Mr. Stec.
Yes. Following the Supreme Court ruling, the state legislature voted to advance the Equal Rights Amendment. That would enshrine the right to an abortion and access to contraception in New York's Constitution. The amendment would need to be passed again in the next legislative term before going to a voter referendum. Mr. Stec, I know that you have voted against that. Would you reaffirm that vote if reelected, and does that reflect the will of voters in the 45th State Senate District?
One of the issues with the constitutional amendment, the ERA Constitution, is very vaguely worded, which means it could be very openly and broadly interpreted and potentially abused, and that's the reason why I voted against it, is that I can see this as, again, opening the door for more late-term abortions up until the last term of pregnancy, and that's just something that I don't think voters want. If it was worded more tightly, then perhaps I'd give it another look, and if that changes, then I'll let you know, but as it was currently written, it's not something I would support.
Equal rights as it relates to women, right to privacy, right to access as an abortion, to an abortion, protecting pregnant women. Those are all in the Equal Rights Amendment. And yes, constitutional amendments will be more broad and subject to interpretation. That is the nature of them. And we need to protect more people, not fewer people. When we talk about late-term abortions, even for myself, at 16 weeks, I was making plans for my life with having another child. And people who are having abortions late in their pregnancy, it's for a very serious reason, and we need to let the medical providers and the individuals make that decision.
Our next question will come from Pat Bradley.
Thank you. Ms. Lapper, New York's Concealed Carry Improvement Act was passed this summer during what was called an extraordinary session of the legislature. It was signed subsequently by Governor Kathy Hochul. It includes provisions that prohibit carrying guns in sensitive areas such as parks and requires, quote, good moral character to obtain a license. The law resulted in cancellations of some historical reenactments across the state and also angered gun-owning Adirondack residents who worry that the unclarified definition of park in the new law would make them felons. Lawsuits have been filed, and a recent ruling by a district court judge ruled a number of its provisions are unconstitutional, including the provisions I just mentioned. Attorney General Letitia James has appealed, and an interim stay was issued by an appellate judge. Is the Concealed Carry Improvement Act viable?
So first I want to state that I fully support the Second Amendment. I come from 4 generations of law enforcement, and I have a sister who works in the Department of Corrections, and what I've learned is that with our rights requires responsibility. The legislature responded to a change by a Supreme Court decision, and the government is always being faulted for moving too slowly. This time they move very quickly, and as a result, there's some flaws in the law and some clarifications that need to be made. I've made public statements about the fact that I think that there are clearly some common sense changes need to be made, such as allowing people in the Adirondack Park to carry their guns to hunt, as well as I attended a reenactment in Malone while my opponent was staging a political stunt in Fort Edward where they canceled their reenactment. Common sense says that they should be able to continue to go on. I want to work with all the stakeholders required to correct the law and to make it palatable for the North Country.
Thank you. Mr. Stec, 1 minute.
I'm one of 2 candidates that received an A+ rating from a questionnaire in my voting record in the State Assembly and State Senate. 2 candidates statewide that got an A+. My opponent didn't bother to fill out the NRA questionnaire, so she was issued a question mark. A lot of candidates say they're pro-Second Amendment. We've all seen that in the North Country, and then we see evidence either after they're elected or before then to the contrary. My record on the NRA or on the Second Amendment is crystal clear, and as I said on the debate floor, a lot of what that law did was unconstitutional. One court has already agreed. There's no doubt in my mind that when it gets to the end, it will be ruled unconstitutional. But the idea that people need to give up their social media passwords to the government to exercise their Second Amendment is ludicrous. And I want to know who's going to define good moral character. That is exactly what the Supreme Court threw out when they ruled against the state's concealed carry law. There's just so much wrong with this, and it's costing people access to their right to keep and bear arms.
Ms. Lapper.
Last week I met with the head of a local rod and gun club, and he told me that his membership was fully supportive of background checks. I understand that like I said, that with these rights comes responsibility, and we need to keep the public safe. So we need to keep the guns out of the hands of people with long history of mental health issues as well as domestic violence crimes, and we need to keep the public safe.
Again, no one's in favor of gun violence. However, the state of New York has taken a hard left turn when it comes to all things criminal justice. And instead of punishing criminals and hammering people when they violate the law, especially when they violate the law with firearms, the state of New York and the Democrats that run the place have called out lawful gun owners and frankly just are harassing and intimidating and making it impossible for these people to protect their homes and their families. And they're not the problem. It is the lawbreakers that should be dealt with. It's criminal justice and not law-abiding gun owners to blame.
All right, candidates, thank you. Next question from Cara Chapman, and it will be going to you, Mr. Stec.
Last month, Governor Kathy Hochul's administration okayed a plan to lower the farm worker overtime threshold to 40 hours per week over the next 10 years. Farmers say it'll raise costs and make laborers seek work elsewhere. Advocacy groups like the Worker Justice Center of New York say it's about time that farm workers are granted the same rights as people in other sectors. Governor Kathy Hochul says a new tax credit enacted in this year's budget will cover the cost of overtime for farm owners. My question has 2 parts. First, should the overtime threshold be lowered, and what's the best course for balancing food security and workers' rights?
1 minute, Mr. Stec.
All right. The answer to your first part, no, absolutely not. And I opposed the creation of the Farm Labor Board in the beginning that established 60 to begin with, and then certainly have been very vocal in my communications to the second floor and to along with my other colleagues on both sides of the aisle that we should not be lowering the threshold to 40. People need to realize that two things are going to happen. One, we are going to be driving workers away from New York. They're going to go to other places that aren't going to put these restrictions on their ability to raise money. So we're going to have an even bigger impact on our ability to find a workforce that wants to do this. And secondly, it's going to make the cost of what we produce in New York much more expensive. So people are, instead of buying New York apples, are going to be buying Washington apples. So we're hurting ourselves here. The second part of your question, Cara?
How do you balance food security with workers' rights?
Well, again, you know, I believe in the free market, and certainly I think that if you work with the Farm Bureau, there's ways to find a balance here where workers are protected. But it's many of the workers themselves that are saying that they do not want this. I was in Peru, and there were migrant workers there, and they were saying that they did not want to see this threshold lowered, and if it was, they would go to another state.
So I also met with some farmers, particularly small farmers in Clinton County, in Franklin County, and in St. Lawrence County over the last few weeks, and they had said similar things where they felt that they were treating their employees well, and that if we increase the overtime rate or decrease the hours to 40 hours, that therefore their workers would go out of town. They would move to another state or work in another state. But we need to balance the workers' rights. We need to treat people well. We need to ensure that the workers are fairly treated, as well as are given good housing and other protections where we're treating them like the good citizens that they are, that are helping us create our food supply. Also for the farmers, the way to balance out how they can be helped out more is to provide more avenues for their products, okay? Whether it's through schools and other government institutions, we can provide a market for their products, which we would like to keep in New York, and therefore maintain the sustainability of their business.
All right, thank you, Mr. Stec. Anything to add? All right, let's move on to the next question, and Pat Bradley.
The Clean Water, Clean Air, and Green Jobs Environmental Bond Act of 2022 will be on the ballot for voters in November. It asks New Yorkers to approve bonding up to $4.2 billion with a B, which includes at least $1.1 billion for climate restoration and flood risk reduction, up to $1.5 billion for climate change mitigation, up to $650 million for open space land conservation, and at least $650 million for water quality improvement and resilient infrastructure. Dan Stec, you have indicated that you oppose the Bond Act, but communities in the North Country need the infrastructure funding, and environmentalists say the monies would benefit the Adirondacks. Can you explain and justify your opposition?
Actually, first of all, though, it's going to Ms. Lapper. The first question.
Okay.
She's getting this question first, so Ms. Lapper, that's coming your way.
Can you explain if you support it, and if so, why or why not?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Pat. So as I said in my opening, I support the $4.2 billion investment in New York State. I think it'll be a game changer for the North Country, creating immediate jobs as well as long-term sustaining jobs, which is what families need for opportunity. They don't just need a job for a year or two, they need to be able to have a career so that they can make a life here. The money is critical for funding infrastructure to municipalities, towns, and villages without them having to raise their taxes. It will also provide protections for the Adirondacks, which is essential. My opponent got the lowest rating by the New York League of Conservation Voters of all of the senators in New York State. The representative of the Adirondacks got the lowest environmental rating of all of the senators. That's unconscionable. In addition, what we can do is we can raise money through the marketplace without having to raise taxes. So that's essential for creating jobs, mitigating floods, as well as providing the clean air and clean water that we so desperately need.
The state of New York already has over $50 billion in debt. Almost all of it is not voter approved, which is unconstitutional. If there's a bright side to the $4.2 billion that's on the ballot, is that at least it will be voter approval driven. So I think there's a bright side there. When I was in the Assembly, I was the ranking, still am the ranking member of the Environmental Conservation Committee, and I was a chair of a task force that went around the state and looked at water quality issues. If I believed that the $4.2 billion that we're setting aside would go to good infrastructure projects like water and wastewater, and there's evidence out there, there's reports that say that we're looking at $70 to $80 billion of capital improvements just for water and wastewater alone that are needed in the state. That is money well spent, and we should be doing more to fund that. My concern is that this $4.2 billion, as you described and broken down, is going to be spent inefficiently. And for that reason, I have my doubts whether or not it's going to make a difference, or if it's just going to check some boxes for people to feel good about saying they support the environment. I don't think it's going to be efficiently used, and I'm afraid it's going to get wasted or squandered.
Ms. Lapper.
So I think it's essential as the senator, as a CPA, as an accountant, to make sure the money gets spent well, and to also make sure that we get our fair share in the North Country. That is the job of the senator, is to make sure that we get our share, and we have so many municipalities that could use the money to upgrade their water systems, to have climate mitigation measures put in place, and we desperately need these sustainable jobs. I also want to point out that labor, environmental groups, as well as business groups have all supported this bond act. And it's rare that you can get those three organizations with differing views and differing needs to agree. And they've all agreed that this would be good for New York State.
We are now moving on to some of the questions that have been submitted to us by our viewers. We had several viewers ask questions about election integrity that we have combined into one question. U.S. states have enacted more than 30 new voting restrictions since 2020, from voter ID requirements to limits on mail-in voting to laws that could lead to partisan interference in how elections are run and how results are determined. Republicans, including many who have largely embraced former President Donald Trump's claims of fraud in the 2020 election, say the measures are necessary to ensure election integrity. Democrats say they are aimed at making it harder for certain voters to cast their ballots. The question for you: what does the state of New York need to do to protect election integrity, to protect the counting of our vote and our electors? And Mr. Stec, we're beginning with you. 1 minute.
Sure. I think certainly one of the issues would be voter lists. They haven't been culled or reviewed in many years, and so that always raises a question as to, we want to make sure that every vote is counted and only the lawfully cast votes are counted. And a lot of counties haven't kept up with keeping their voter lists updated. But with that said, I think New York is already one of the most accessible states as far as access to voting in the country. In all my travels, I've never heard anyone talk about a long wait that stopped them from voting or hassle at the polling stations, and I've been doing this for a long time. I have concerns about mail-in ballots. When you mail every ballot to everyone like we did 2 years ago without them asking for it, you've got all these ballots floating around. There's a concern there, could that get abused or not abused? I would be very cautious in relying on the mail for everything, as some other states have, because there's always an opportunity for abuse. But our Board of Elections system has Republicans and Democrats keeping an eye on each other to make sure that as much as possible that the system works. And I know that they all do a good job, at least in the 6 counties that I represent, in trying to make sure that those rules are followed.
Ms. Lapper.
So in New York State, there has never been any indication of any type of fraud. We have a very good election system. The different counties don't speak to each other, so the duties are segregated. As a CPA, as a former auditor, I understand how segregating things, improves the integrity of the count. We don't have a problem with too many votes being cast. If anything, we have not enough people voting. So that's where we need to have some improvement. I think mail-in voting is very helpful, particularly in this area where we have a lot of rural communities. It may be hard to get to vote on election day, and we need to make things more accessible for the average person. Somebody who's working 2 jobs and may not be able to get to the polls on election day need to have other opportunities. So I fully support continuing to fund early voting. I encourage mail-in voting because I think we have good voting systems in New York.
Rebuttals, candidates? All right, next question from a viewer. Lisa Meissner asks, for 7 years, advocates have called for the Senate to pass the Medical Aid in Dying Act to give New Yorkers facing life-threatening illnesses the option of choosing to end their own life. Where do you stand on this legislation? Do you support its passage in the New York State Senate? If yes, why? If not, why not? And this question is going first to Ms. Lapper.
Okay, so I think I need to do some further investigation and further research on this issue. Just like access to reproductive health care, this is a very complex and a very personal decision. I've experienced in my own family when someone has been very sick and some will do anything to last the extra day and another person is ready to go. And it's not my decision to decide, which of those is the better course. I think that we need to look into it and come up with a good, reasonable approach to how to handle end-of-life care. We don't do a great job with end-of-life care. It's become very expensive. It's very cumbersome. There's not a lot of good access to it, and we need to address this. And we need the input of providers as well as healthcare. Care providers, as well as the doctors, as well as families and spiritual advisors to help us with this.
Ms. Lapper, thank you. Mr. Stec, a minute.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the bill. My time in the legislature, it's come up for discussion, and I've heard advocacy and I've read opinions for both sides of the issue. And frankly, it is a very personal and important issue to so many people. And if we're all fortunate enough to get older in our years, at some point we're all going to be faced with the end-of-life care decisions, perhaps for our parents, and certainly, like I said, with some fortune for ourselves. And these are difficult questions. They can be very trying on a family. The concern that I have with the way that the bill is currently written is that it's open to abuse, that then we'll be putting financial concerns in front of personal or family concerns. There will be insurance companies that will be looking at this from an actuarial standpoint and encouraging or driving decisions in a certain way. I'm not sure that that's in the best interest of individuals or our state. A lot of advocates of people with disabilities have specifically expressed strong opposition to this bill for those sorts of reasons. And so, as currently written, I have not supported it. But it's also important to point out it has not come to the floor for a vote yet either. So that's not something that I'm preventing, and I don't have that kind of a power to do so. But it hasn't come for a vote yet.
All right, candidates, rebuttals? All right, next question will come from Cara Chapman.
Over the last 20 years, the number of people incarcerated in state prisons has declined by half. In that time, dozens of facilities have closed, including in the 45th State Senate District. Just in the last 2 years, Mariah Shock and the Clinton Annex were shuttered, despite efforts to get the governor's office to change course. I do have a follow question on this, but my first question is, can you say no to consolidating the prison system with such a steep decline in incarcerated individuals?
Coming to you first, Mr. Stec, 1 minute.
Yeah, certainly it doesn't make a lot of sense to have an empty building. I think we all understand that, but the question is, how did we get there? And certainly a lot of work has been done in recent years under one-party rule to decriminalize everything, to empty prisons. We've changed parole, so now the only way that somebody can violate parole and go back into prison is if they commit a new crime. That's part of our criminal justice and our public safety crisis is what's been done to parole. So I question why we're entering these prisons. But with that said, when we close these prisons, we have we leave a hole in that community where now this building, a state asset owned by the taxpayers, is allowed to rot. We've seen that in Gabriel's, we've seen that in Lyon Mountain, we've seen that in Chateauguay, not in the district, but just south of where we both live. We've seen that in Mount McGregor and Saratoga County. Trying to prevent that from happening, the Clinton Annex into Mariah Shock. The state needs to be a good steward of taxpayer resources and taxpayer assets like these prisons. But certainly we want our prisons to be safe. That's a whole other matter. And I see I'm out of time.
All right, Ms. Lapper, 1 minute.
You want to repeat the question, though?
Yes. My first question is, can you say no to consolidating the prison system with such a steep decline in incarcerated individuals?
Okay. So clearly we have assets in the North Country that need better stewardship. I think we need to make proposals to use those assets. We can use them for our primary area of our primary area of crime in the area relates to drug and alcohol abuse and use disorders. And we can use those prisons to create resources and facilities to handle those areas. I sat on the Warren County on the Warren County Grand Jury for 6 months last year, and every case was related to drugs and alcohol. And so clearly we need to be looking at what the problems are that are creating the crimes, and we need to address that.
All right. And do we want any rebuttals before we do have a follow-up question coming from Cara related?
Okay, so you both touched on this at least a little bit, but if you wanted to expand, what is the state's obligation to repurpose the infrastructure and make the surrounding communities whole when a facility does close?
And Mr. Stec?
All right. Well, again, the closure, first of all, several of these closures, each of the last 3 budget years, this authority to close these prisons was given away by the legislature to the executive in the negotiation for the budget. So it was placed in the hands of Governor Cuomo, and then after that, Governor Hochul, and they certainly did exercise the use of this. But in closing them, you always question the wisdom or the politics behind closing some of these facilities. But the bottom line is that you've got a community in the North Country that in the 80s raised its hand when no other communities did, saying we will take the prisons. They built the prisons, and there's an obligation to those communities that stuck their neck out and took the good and the bad that comes with having a prison in your community. Now the state decided to change direction, and they're closing these prisons without any thought or process for how to keep these open. I've toured every single one of my prisons in my district at least twice in the last couple of years. I've been to all of them, including the ones that have closed. What's happened at Gabriel's is a shame. It's falling apart, and if they had moved quicker on a plan, you would have had something that was saleable and salvageable, but now it's falling apart. And again, my fear is that this is going to continue to happen, and we will have these blights on our North Country communities, and there's no excuse for these governors to allow this to happen.
Ms. Lapper, you have a minute.
Okay. Yeah, well, as I stated earlier, clearly the state should make better use of these assets. And clearly we need to change the local economy in the North Country, that it cannot just be reliant on prisons and on corrections. We need to provide the green jobs that we talked about earlier. We need to expand our economy. And I want to know where Senator Stec was when he was in the Assembly and the Senate. Where were his proposals for how we should repurpose these buildings? And where was he to provide legislation and offer suggestions for how we can improve the North Country economy?
Mr. Stec?
Well, clearly my opponent isn't familiar with my assembly district, but the 8 years that I was in the assembly, none of the prisons that were shuttered were in my assembly district. There were a couple that were closed in Billy Jones's assembly district. But again, I've opposed the closure authority that was given to the governors to do this, and we've been very outspoken with docs. I've been to the Department of Corrections and met with their commissioner several times, and this has always come up as a concern. Governor Hochul has at least done a little more in creating a panel that Governor Cuomo never did, but they control these buildings, and there's nothing that the legislature can do about it directly.
Any final points to make, candidates, on this?
Sure. I am familiar with your assembly district because I live there. But what I'm saying is I hear that you've opposed things, but I didn't hear any solutions being offered. And I'm looking to offer some solutions and not just be a representative who says, no, 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 we need to know what we don't like and then offer solutions to address the needs.
This past year, I've begged for audiences with members of the second floor. I've had a few meetings with them, along with local officials from Essex County, specifically talking about Mariah's shock. I had a lot, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And when the governor's determined to close a facility come hell or high water, it's very difficult, but it hasn't been for lack of trying on my end.
Our next question comes from Pat Bradley.
One of the issues that has been recurring over the past few months is crime and bail reform. New York's original bail reform law passed in 2019 and was revised in 2020, but it still faces some criticism, including from Ms. Lapper, your opponent, Dan Stec. The critics say there's been a rise in violent crime since bail reform took effect, but according to a statewide analysis by the Albany Times-Union, only 2% in 100,000 cases were rearrested for a violent felony. The Brennan Center reported no evidence linking bail reform to an increase in crime in New York City. On prison safety, the Department of Corrections data from October 1st showed a decrease from 2021 in assaults on prison staff statewide. The numbers showed 1,177 last year versus 1,112 this year. So if the data is showing a decrease in criminal offenses, are revisions to bail reform and/or the HALT Act necessary?
Ms. Lapper, 1 minute.
Thanks. Well, we had learned that bail reform in its original format was flawed and that it needed some adjustments. But we need to keep in mind that bail was intended to keep the public safe, and unfortunately it's become a tool to punish the people who cannot afford to pay bail. So I'm the only candidate in this race who thinks that no one should be kept in jail because of an inability to pay. We must be able to provide law enforcement with the tools necessary to keep our communities safe. As I said earlier, we don't see an increase in crime. We have not seen an increase in crime in our area. And the crimes that we do see are related to drugs and alcohol for the most part. And we need to provide solutions for people to get to the core reasons for crime. And that's where I'd like to spend some time, where we bring in all the stakeholders and get to the bottom of what's wrong in our environment and what's wrong in our communities where people are committing crimes.
I completely disagree. I think that our bail reform has proven statewide to be a disaster. Law enforcement on both sides of the issue, both in this district and across the state, will agree with that. As recently as a week ago, former Lieutenant Governor Bob Duffy, the immediate predecessor to Lieutenant Governor Hochul, said that we should be having a special session immediately to address specifically bail reform. That was Bob Duffy. So he's not a partisan Republican criticizing this administration and bail reform under one-party Democrat rule. He's a leader of the Democratic Party, and he's saying that bail reform is a disaster. As recently as today or yesterday, Melissa DeRosa, somebody that's chief aide to former Governor Cuomo, a household name, again, not a partisan Republican, but a leader in the Democratic Party, also criticized crime and the directions going in New York State. I can tell you that corrections will tell you that in prison, both inmate on inmate and inmate on staff has gone up 35 to 37% since HALT was put in. I'm the author of the repeal HALT bill. I'm also co-sponsor of a bill that would repeal bail reform. Bail reform has turned out to be a disaster for public safety, and there's the statistics show it.
Ms. Lapper?
Yep. Well, clearly, public safety needs to guide us. We can't be, we need leadership that looks at the issues and comes up with some common sense answers, and not politicians that are working on fear just so that they can get reelected. The numbers are bearing out that crime is not on the increase. As I mentioned earlier, I have a sister who works in the Department of Corrections, and her safety every day when she goes to work is really important to me, and we need to address the issues that are at hand and not work on the politics of fear.
Mr. Stec.
This isn't politics of fear, this is fact. In 2022 alone, there have been 2 homicides in Plattsburgh. There's a homicide in Tupper Lake. Last week, there was a homicide in Malone, and a few weeks back before that, there was an officer-involved fatal shooting in Saranac Lake. This is just my Senate district just this year. Furthermore, Assemblyman Matt Simpson had a nephew that was robbed at gunpoint in a McDonald's in South Glens Falls, and another nephew, brother of the first nephew, that was robbed at the Lake George Marriott. Crime is on the increase. I've talked to all my sheriffs and I've talked to my district attorneys. They're all concerned about specifically bail reform, but overall the direction of public safety. And like I said, so does Bob Duffy and Melissa DeRosa.
Our next question is going to come from the candidates themselves to their opponent. Mr. Stec, your question for Ms. Lapper, please. And Ms. Lapper, you'll have 1 minute to respond.
All right, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity for this. My question is going to focus on broadband. Broadband is something that's important in today's economy for a variety of reasons, and we all agree on that. In 2015, the state passed, as part of the budget, one of the bills, $500 million in the budget I voted in favor of for the broadband program to expand broadband. And at that time, in 2015, 8% of the Senate district census tracts were considered covered by the state of New York as under broadband. Today, 7 years later into that program, we're at 75% of the census tracts, and that translates to a population of about 94% of my Senate district has access to broadband. Bipartisan effort amongst myself and the Assembly members that are in my Senate district, including Democrat Billy Jones and Kerry Warner and Republican Matt Simpson. We've held joint forums, joint Zooms. We've sponsored legislation successfully, both in and outside of the budget. We've written letters to the governor and to the Public Service Commission. We've done all this together. We've gotten results, but there's more to do, and we're still working on it. And fortunately, there's more work in the pipeline. In contrast, you've had a lot of criticism in your rhetoric on these results. So my question would be, what specifically would you have done differently, or would you do differently going forward that we haven't done that would yield better results than we have?
1 minute, Ms. Lapper.
Okay, clearly there remains a digital divide. I'm familiar with the mandate in 2015 to bring broadband to our area. We've been talking about it for decades, but as I travel the district, the average person in the Adirondacks and in a lot of the small towns and communities say that they don't either have access or it's not affordable. So we need to create resources so that low-income families have access to affordable broadband. So many of the homes that don't have it, it's because they can't afford to have it. And it's critical for business, it's critical for healthcare, and it's critical for the education of our children.
All right, any further
I
discussion?
did not hear an answer to my question. My question was, what specifically would my opponent do differently that Kerry Warner, Billy Jones, Matt Simpson, and I haven't been doing in the last 7 years that we've been working on this problem when we've gotten from 8% to 75% of census tracts and 94% of the population?
I did answer the question. What I said is, as I travel the district, there are many people who do not have access to affordable broadband. These are families that I've talked to that are sitting outside the library with their children doing their homework because they can't afford to have broadband. So we need to finish out this project. We need to finish out the last 25%, and we also need to make it affordable to the average working family and poor family, because it's critical for healthcare, for business, and for education.
Next question will come from Ms. Lapper to Mr. Stec. Ms. Lapper?
Yes. So I'd like to ask my opponent where he's been when. So I want to ask him directly why he thinks that people who can't afford to pay bail should go to jail.
Mr. Stec, 1 minute.
I have never said that. As a matter of fact, I've been on record many times saying that no one thinks that somebody should be sitting in jail because they stole a loaf of bread. What we saw in the bail reforms that were rammed through under one-party rule was a case where they were pointing to a young person that had allegedly stolen a backpack in the New York City area and spent about a year in jail in Rikers. Now, what many people don't know is that Rikers is not a state facility. It is a New York City correctional facility. So that's point number one that was lost. But we changed the entire corrections system and criminal justice system because of one failing in New York City for one person, which was a tragedy. But what we've had is we need to give our judges more discretion to keep people that are likely to reoffend, that are likely to hurt people, the authority to control that. You're taking somebody off the streets in a bar situation, you're processing them, and 2 hours later you're releasing that person back onto the very streets. The bars are still open and they're going back in to finish what they started. That's got to end. And again, law enforcement official after law enforcement official has been begging for that. And to this point, under one-party rule, Albany has been ignoring those pleas.
Ms. Lapper, any follow-up?
Yes. So I'd just like to say that, you know, what we need from our representative is to work with the other legislators to figure out the common sense answers to these things. More discretion has been given to judges. And at the end of the day, people who can't afford to post bail are the ones who end up in jail, and they shouldn't end up in jail. The people in our communities who can't afford bail should not end up in jail just because they can't afford it. And what we need is a leader who works with their counterparts, with their peers in Albany, to work out common sense solutions. We need to bring the issues and the needs of the Adirondacks and of the families in the North Country to Albany and work with the people there to get the solutions.
All right, next question from Cara Chapman. And it will be going to Ms. Lapper.
Okay, and this is another two-parter. Keep doing that. There is an affordable housing crisis in the North Country. Many locals looking to buy a home are being priced out of the market, and increases in rent often outpace those for income. Short-term rentals and vacant properties exacerbate the lack of available units. In the 45th State Senate District, we've seen the recent groundbreaking at Harrison Place in Malone and the completion of Northwoods in Plattsburgh. Both are affordable housing complexes backed with millions in state funding. My questions are, is there enough affordable housing development going on in the North Country? And what's the state's obligation to make sure the residents here have homes?
Ms. Lapper, 1 minute.
Sure. Yes. No, there is not enough affordable housing in the region, and it starts down in Glens Falls and goes all the way up to Malone. The entire region does not have enough housing for workers. That's what we're talking about when we talk about affordable housing. We're talking about housing for teachers and nurses and police officers and average middle income people and young families that are starting out. Clearly the state has a role in investing in developments that will provide more affordable housing. We have the real estate to do it with, and we can partner with private developers to get the housing that we need. I've heard time and time again about people who try to hire someone and then they don't have anywhere to live. We have a crisis of productivity in the area because we don't have enough workers. And we need young families to want to make a life here. We need to enable them to afford to live here and to have a good paying job along with an affordable place to live.
All right, Mr. Stec, 1 minute.
Cara, could you please repeat the second part of the question?
What is the state's obligation to make sure the residents here have homes?
Okay, thank you. Certainly I completely agree, and as I've traveled and represented this area for a long time, affordable housing is in short supply here. It's only gotten worse in recent years. A lot of that is because of rising costs. Everything, you know, between supply chain issues, energy, inflation, taxes, the regulatory environment. It's very difficult to start a new project in the Adirondack Park when every environmental group opposes, all shovels in the ground and any hammers being swung. But there's been a lot of state investment that I've supported. The Tupper Lake DRI, Tupper Lake was recently awarded $10 million. A project that you mentioned, Plattsburgh and Malone, Harrison Place, I've been very involved with citizens advocates advocating on their behalf for that project, the demolition. It's going to be transformative to their downtown, and I'm excited about the work they're doing. Lake Placid has several projects going on right now, as is Glens Falls. Glens Falls recently completed a similar project. There's more, it's not enough. The demand is larger than the supply. I believe in the free market, but I think the state could do more to make the dollar go farther if we could rein in our regulations and the high cost of doing business, including building housing in the Adirondacks.
And did you have a follow-up question, Cara?
I do. And would this go to Mr. Stec next?
Yes.
Okay. So, Ms. Lapper, you touched on this a little bit, but the impacts of the housing crisis are being felt in other important sectors. The Adirondack Daily Enterprise recently reported on how it's contributing to vacancies in the healthcare and education fields. For example, Adirondack Health recently announced plans to close the emergency room at its Lake Placid facility in part due to the lack of local staff. What should be done at the state level to address housing for these critical workers and attract them to the North Country?
And Mr. Stec, you have a minute for this.
All right. Oh, well, again, we need to continue to invest. These projects that we've done, we need to continue those. There's several that are coming online in the Lake Placid area right now. But you're absolutely right, and I've met with the staff at Adirondack Daily Enterprise in the past, and this has been a focus of theirs, that everyone's having a hard time attracting staff right now, and that's staff whether or not to build housing. But again, as was pointed out, there's a lot of demand for affordable housing for workers that just can't afford it. The state needs to continue to support these programs, but again, the state also needs to look in the mirror and rein in its own affordability challenges that it's putting on would-be developers, would-be housing providers.
Ms. Lepper, 1 minute.
Yeah, right. I mean, right now we're in a crisis for affordable housing. And as my opponent said, he's been going around the area for years. Well, where was the leadership years ago to see this coming and to fund it? What I'm seeing is him voting against every item in the budget. So the funding that provides the affordable housing is being denied to this area. And we need someone to go to Albany to make sure that we get our share of the resources. What we've seen when the investments have been made in areas where there's been DRI money, private money follows the DRI money. So the state is the catalyst, and then private money comes in and it makes the downtown areas more viable. It invests in small business. And I've been talking to school superintendents and teachers and nurses and healthcare providers and my own clients, myself in the accounting industry. We're really challenged to find young people to want to work here and to want to live here because the wages and the housing costs are not matched. And that's something different than what it was when I first came to the area. And I was able to make a really nice life for myself, and I'd like to have the same opportunity for my children and other families in the North Country.
Mr. Stec.
Yep, my opponent just mentioned saying that you want to support certain aspects in the budget and then voting against budget bills. Under one-party rule, the state's budget has grown tremendously in size. We're now bigger than Texas and Florida's budget combined. The state is spending enough money. It's how we allocate it. But why vote against budget bills? Well, bail reform was done in the budget. The prison closure authority was done in the budget. $600 million to the Bills Stadium was done in the budget. $2.1 billion for unemployment for illegal immigrants was in the budget. Take that $2.1 billion and put that into affordable housing upstate. That would have made a difference, but we gave that to illegal immigrants. So just a variety of things. There's good stuff in the budget, but I'm not going to sell my yes vote for pennies in order to throw dollars out the window.
Any final points?
Sure. Well, I think when I'm in the state Senate, we won't be getting pennies. I want to make sure that I'm at the table asking for the money for our schools, for our towns, for our municipalities, as well as for affordable housing. This is what we need. Where have you been for the last 20 years when you've been in office and things have been deteriorating in the North Country? We need to get our share, and we need to be sitting at the table asking for the money and making sure the needs of our communities are being represented.
Final thoughts? All right. Pat Bradley, next question, and it will be going to Mr. Stec.
Okay, this kind of continues on the affordability theme. Congress recently passed an additional $1 billion in emergency supplemental low-income home energy assistance program funds. That's known generally as LIHEAP. $60 million of that will come to New York State. That comes at the same time that National Grid put out some information predicting a 39% increase in energy costs this winter. For natural gas, they estimate that's going to be an average extra $263 for heating costs. What additional steps do you support the state taking to help lower fuel, heating, electric, and any other kind of power costs?
1 minute, Mr. Stec.
All right, well, first of all, the federal government and frankly my colleagues on the other side of the aisle in state government have made a disaster out of energy policy, which is why we're seeing energy skyrocketing, and that's affecting everything from food prices to home heating. I mentioned in my opening the 39-40% increase that National Grid is telling us. A lot of the mistakes are self-inflicted wounds done by both Washington and Albany. Now, energy is something I happen to know about. I said in my opening that I was trained as a chemical engineer at Clarkson University, and I was in the Navy's nuclear power program for 8 years. I know something about electrical power generation and distribution. We don't have the grid to do all the things that the Greens want to do to the state. These are noble things to want to care about the environment, but you can't just arbitrarily pick a date and say we're going to eliminate the combustion engine or we're going to have all houses There's proposals that all new construction would have to be fully electric by 2024, 6 stories and below. That's just going to exacerbate exactly what you're talking about. So there's things that we could do policy-wise to unleash our own ability to provide energy and lower our own energy costs, or we are about to see a very, very, very bad winter.
Ms. Lapper, 1 minute.
Sure. Well, I think investment in new green technologies will help this a long way. The best protection against inflation is a good job, and we need to provide good jobs for our families in the North Country. I understand there's an immediate need, and we need to help out the families, poor families who can't afford to pay their heating bills this year. That's essential. We need to make sure that we get our share of the money into the North Country to make sure that people stay warm and comfortable over the winter time. And beyond that, we need to look beyond this winter and invest in green jobs. We need to invest in new technologies, and we do need to set a time, because it's more than noble to protect our environment. We're given one precious earth, and we need to protect it. We need to protect it for ourselves and for our families.
Thank you, candidates. I'm going to have to move on now to our closing statements. Mr. Stec, we're going to begin with you. 1 minute, 30 seconds.
All right, thank you very much again for this opportunity. To the voters in the 45th Senate District, make no mistake, this ballot is a referendum on one-party rule, both in Washington and Albany. One-party Democratic rule, specifically in the last 4 years here in New York State. 3 areas of concern, certainly the economy, criminal justice, and our freedoms. And in the area of the economy, our budget is larger than Florida and Texas's combined. There's no reason for that. That's criminally irresponsible that our budget's that large. 300,000 people left New York State last year. They didn't leave for the weather. They left because of better opportunities economically for them and their families. We've seen record inflation, energy, and food costs here in New York State. Again, a lot of it brought on by our own poor policies. And again, heating is going to go up 40% this year. Under criminal justice, literally under one-party rule, every aspect of criminal justice and public safety has been negatively impacted, whether it's parole or criminal or corrections or the cashless bail, the anti-police rhetoric that's coming from Democrats in Albany, and then certainly our Second Amendment has been under attack constantly. These are things that are all done by one party and one party alone. When a party drives the bus into the ditch, you don't let them keep driving, you take the keys away. The only message to send would be to remove Democrats and add Republicans so that there's checks and balances and accountability and increased transparency, and that's not happening under one-party rule in Albany. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Lapper, 1:30.
Again, thank you, everyone. Thank you to my opponent for having this opportunity. And I just want to reiterate that I got into this race because I wanted to protect a woman's right to reproductive health care, to protect our environment, and to improve the lives of families and the economy in the North Country. As a longtime CPA, business owner, and through my grassroots work with various nonprofit organizations like the Rotary Club and the United Way, I've seen firsthand the needs of the communities. I've been traveling all throughout the district for the last 5 months, going door to door and asking people what's on their mind. And people feel like they're neglected. So I want to make sure that I take the needs of the North Country to Albany and work with my colleagues in the Senate to get the needs of our area met. People feel like they are being left out and there is no one at the table advocating for them. I've heard repeatedly from elected officials who said things like, when I ask for help, the most frustrating thing is I hear, I can't help you, I'm not in the majority. And well, that's not a reason. We can't get what we need unless we ask. And I've worked my entire life in my family, in my career, and in my community service to help people, regardless of who they are or what their beliefs are, to help them meet their basic needs. And I'd like to go to the state Senate and continue that work that I've done in the community and bring it to public service.
Ms. Lapper, thank you. Our thanks to the candidates, our panel, our volunteers with the League of Women Voters, who are our official timers, and to you, our viewers. Thanks for watching. Please vote on Election Day, Tuesday, November 8th, if not before. Early voting begins next weekend on Saturday, October 29th in New York State and runs through Sunday, November 6th. You can find the hours for all of the days for early voting on your local County Board of Elections website. For all of us here at Mountain Lake PBS, I'm Tom Halleck. Thanks for watching our Vote 2022 election special.